Welcome, everybody. Today's guest is Daniel Ioannou. Did I say it right?
Yeah, that's great.
Daniel is a creative director at Antler, a creative leader with over a decade of experience building brands across industries, markets, and cultures. Throughout his career, Dan has helped shape identities for global brands and emerging companies alike, bringing together creativity, strategy, and thoughtful leadership. I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome to Fully Managed.
Thanks so much for having me. And I feel like I could get that intro every day. It would make me feel great about myself. It makes it sound way more important than I actually am. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have the chat.
I love to hear that. So you have built your career across two very different creative worlds, like starting in Sydney and eventually landing in New York, working with brands ranging from global financial institutions to fast-growing startups. So looking back, how has changing environments shaped the way you see creativity itself?
It's a really interesting question. I think in some ways it's changed my perspective a lot, and in other ways it's just reinforced things that maybe I didn't realize were always true. Um,
Okay.
Australia, I think I was really fortunate in, the way that I came through the industry and the people I got to interact with and kind of learn from. I think always had this like tenacity and want to be bigger than what we
Yeah.
were in like the best possible way. Like,
Yeah.
I think we had a lot of expats in Australia. I feel like I often joke being in New York now that I know more Australians here than I did in Australia. And I think because we are so far from everything, we have this desire to want to be making our own interpretation of what we see in the world, but also really connected to the world. And so it it gave me like, and look, this definitely comes from a place of privilege, and I totally acknowledge that. I was able to travel a lot, but I was also able to interact with people from all walks of life in Australia. And that was really inspiring and kind of, gave you like a much broader lens. I think when I arrived in New York, it had long been something on my bucket list. I had traveled here before, but to work here and be amongst kind of some of the biggest and best studios and greatest creatives, it comes with a little bit of a daunting task to it.
Yeah.
But to kind of get back to your question, what it really kind of made me realize after being here in New York for a little bit, was that often, though it's not easy to get to this point, it's the thing that might seem most obvious to start the conversation that is obvious in both markets and both words. It's like asking that question of why and like really trying to kind of understand the problem. And I think sometimes I noticed as I moved to the US and working like bigger organizations and working for bigger organizations and clients, there's so many extra layers, right? Like just it's the nature of scale. Um,
Yeah.
and in Australia, everyone's voice felt really welcome, but also there were no dumb questions. You could ask the why. And when I got here, it felt like sometimes people were skirting around asking the question because they didn't want to be the person in this big beast of a system to ask the thing that actually everyone was thinking. Like,
That's
why
so
that,
real.
what makes sense. So it's been really interesting. Like there's definitely very different cultures, but at the end of the day, the things that have been the most successful tools are really anchored in these like human moments of just being like, let's ask that and let's work together to solve that, or let's find something that might seem simple, but if it's often the thing that's like left because it is simple. And so it's like sometimes that can spark something really interesting. Hopefully that kind of gets a little bit at the two worlds.
That was a beautiful answer. And I just remembered, like, all my past Australian guests have mentioned this, like, or New Zealand, like the biggest strength, it's, the distance, that they were so like isolated from the rest of the world was their biggest, like, that could be like perceived as your biggest disadvantage, but it was actually your biggest strength.
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, like, this is based on zero fact. So, like, if someone's fact checking the podcast, I'll be in trouble. But, there are so many crazy Australian inventions that you learn about as a kid. Wi-Fi, the like rotary clothesline, these things that like seem like these big milestones, like the lawn, like certain types of lawnmowers, and particularly the Wi-Fi thing. I always joke, it's like, of course we wanted Wi-Fi because we wanted to connect to the internet so we could know what's going on in the world. Um, but it's like an interesting thing, right? That distance makes you really interested and intrigued with the world, but it also
Yeah.
gives you space and distance to kind of like process it in your own way, which is like very different in a
Very
city like
cool.
New
Yeah,
York that's like constantly going and
absolutely.
hustling. Yeah.
Super cool. And something that stood out to me is that your career has evolved from being, the person crafting the work to the person creating the conditions where great work can happen. So I'm curious, what changed in your mindset when you realized your biggest impact was no longer just the ideas you created, but the ideas you helped others unlock?
It's a really interesting challenge, I think, in our industry, particularly on the kind of design side, right? Because I think we come through often like some form of sort of like arts based training, right? And I know that's changed a little bit, but you're a maker. That's what you're trained to do. You're trained to
Yeah.
think strategically and execute. And you get to this point in your career where just based on how long and how many times you've done the making, that you should all of a sudden be able to like step into this role where you're like directing and managing people and like managing clients. I think everyone has a different experience here. For me, it actually was a really comfortable transition that I really, really loved. Um, Maybe not what my teams want to hear. Like, I have always been a creative person. I love creativity. I was painting color wheels with it. I'm going to date myself now, like with the rest of us in college. Um, but I also had this like very analytical side of my brain. And I think that for me, where design versus art always was intriguing was how you bring those things together, right? Like how we can use, we're not artists just making things to like evoke a story or like kind of evoke a feeling, though that's partly what we're doing. We're like really trying to make what we do this really rich, commercially viable thing in the world. And the people that I both worked around, as well as like my family, who is like a mix of like creative, but also a CFO, like I've been around these very differing worlds. And to me, transitioning
100%.
into that role of leadership kind of allowed me to tap into both. So it definitely is a skill you have to learn to like, oh, like I wouldn't pick that exact shade of color. And it's like knowing when that's important and going to really like enrich something, whether that's enriching the experience or making that brand better, or if it's just uncomfortable because it's not your idea, but it's actually a better one, like filtering that is a challenge. But
Yeah.
that said, I've also been really fortunate in working with incredibly talented people. So for me, there is just as much satisfaction of seeing something weird and wonderful or beautiful that I would have never thought of and being the person that can help that designer shape that spark of an idea into something that the client is going to understand and appreciate and that is ultimately going to make it into the market. And it's just a different value exchange that I don't think anyone really prepared me for, at least, but it's been really fulfilling once I learned to like let go maybe of like what was seen as valuable as a creative, right? Like being the person that picked the best typeface to being the person who orchestrated the team that could do something magical. And it's been really fulfilling. Like some of my best career moments, yes, they've been the brand launches and the creative moments, but it's been watching my teams grow in places, even if that's meant like sadly like leaving places that they've worked with me to go and like champion and do like amazing things elsewhere. Like you just get satisfaction from different things, I guess.
That's so cool. And that's such a great way to look at leadership. You sound like an amazing leader.
You have to check with my team about that. TBS.
And you've worked with brands like Google, Amazon, Starbucks, Colgate, City, like, and emerging companies like Fixer and Marquetta, and brands at completely different stages of maturity. So after seeing both sides, what separates in your perspective, a brand that is simply recognizable from one that becomes genuinely meaningful to people?
It's interesting because they're obviously very different in nature of
Yeah.
what they're trying to do and establish. And for me, it's part of why I've like moved around whilst I've been in the US is like I really want to experience that broad range that you're
Yeah.
explaining. Like from businesses that are early in their existence or sometimes didn't even exist before you start building the brand to these like established players that have been in the market for a long time. I I think whilst they are different in what you need to do, ultimately I think our job is to really pinpoint what the problem is or what we're trying to enhance or solve. Um, to kind of get to the nuance of like where they're different or what I've experienced most is often they need the same outcomes, right? In terms of maybe outcomes is not the right word. They often need to achieve similar goals. They want to be distinctive and memorable. They want to stand out in their consumer's mind or their customer's mind. Um, but the tactics to get there are often very different. When we're working with a smaller scale brand, they often have less resources, but actually need to cover more ground. And you are basically responsible for evolving that brand or building that brand and every surface that it touches. When you get to these bigger scale organizations, often what's happened is they've already scaled. They're already across a lot of these surfaces, and a lot of it is about taking stock of that and creating cohesion across those surfaces or those places the brand shows up. But they need very different tools to do that, right? Like you take something like City, which was a really long project and is arguably still being kind of rolled out and developed. And it's been almost 2.5 years since we finished that project at Turner Duckworth. That brand needs inherent flexibility. It needs space for different markets to operate. It needs tools that empower like a really decentralized, very big team acting on behalf of the brand.
Yeah.
When we're mobilizing something like Fixer, they're scaling quickly, and it's not to say that they're not growing or being, kind of tackling different markets and different channels and things, but they need like volume of things to take to market. They've got a small focused team that is really smart and savvy and able to think on behalf of the brand because they all sit primarily in one space. But they need tools that are, yes, there's some flexibility, but actually they just need like lots of stuff, if that makes sense. So it's I feel like I've rambled a little bit. I think it's like it's interesting, but there's often learnings from both sides. Like I think the world is changing, right? Like it's so cliche between like technology, but also just customers' expectations, right? That brands show up in more places than they ever were before. Like brands that you never thought you would see pop up on TikTok or like show up then the next day in a giant billboard in Times Square. And so when we start to think about how we build that flexibility, sometimes it's also about taking some of that agile mindset that we're building for this kind of early founded company, right? Because for them, they've got this idea, it's got to get to market and it's got to get in hands of the consumer so they can experience it and do it. These legacy brands, everyone already knows them, but maybe they have a perception that they need to shift, or maybe they just want more people to be aware of what they've been doing so well for so long.
Yeah.
And sometimes being able to bring that mentality or that energy from that kind of startup world and go, actually, like, what if we thought about this? Like, what if it didn't have to be perfect to enter the world in this sort of channel? Is like really interesting to start kind of mixing those thoughts, and something that is really exciting at Red Antler, getting to take their amazing, like the business was founded in that startup world, and the founders, JB and Emily, and so many of the team are like incredible at understanding that world and being able to take that knowledge and then also see how we can apply that to these big institutional brands that have been around for a long time is like a really exciting challenge for me.
Wow, that's fascinating and that's so cool. It feels like you've learned to flow with structure.
That's a great way to sum it up. Yeah, I think it's the type A part of my brain always wants that structure and is used to building these really big systems that people can see the logic in and follow. But actually, as the world changes and as I start to work with different types of clients, you're exactly right. It's like, how do you have enough structure, enough of those sort of
Mhm.
fixed elements to make things coherent, but enough room in there for things
Yeah,
to adapt and change
absolutely.
and kind of go with the flow, to your point.
That's super cool. And you've led creative teams inside some of the world's most respected design studios. But one thing that stood out was your focus on creating cultural rituals and forms within those teams. So, why do you think the environment around creativity is just as important as the creative talent itself?
I think at its core, even though I was just like, we need to, we're not artists, we're here, like, trying to build for the commercial world. I think like creativity isn't always like this linear task. We try
Yeah.
our best to make it fit and, you know, do our timesheets and make sure that things are kind of checked off from an operational perspective. Um, but the reality,
Oh, wait, your sound disconnected. No, I cannot hear you. That's so weird. I can hear you now.
okay, for some reason it's using my phone now.
Maybe
Okay,
the
can you hear me?
Bluetooth connected. Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
All right, let me know if it starts. We can start that again though if you want for sure.
No, it was great. Wait, where did you leave though?
Good question.
We were talking about the creativity, how like it's
Oh,
not
like
like a linear.
culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think culture is really important to a team that is creative because I think even though, like we were saying earlier, we're not just artists, but like creativity is not always linear. And even though we are always inherently trying to be strategic and really thoughtful, sometimes it takes a lot out of you, right? And I think that there's two parts to culture that I think are really, really helpful. One is that as creative people, sometimes we just need space with people that we trust to let our like kind of minds run free. And I also think it's really important to create a space where people feel comfortable to have debate because the reality is if everything looked like I wanted it to look or behaved like I wanted it to behave, the world of branding would be boring as fuck. Pardon if I'm probably beat me out if I need to. Um, Whereas I feel like, but the only way that you can kind of have that dialogue is by creating space for it. I think it's a tough thing though to create, right? I think I've worked in environments where we were maybe all too close, and there's kind of this like metaphor of family where like the reality is like, yes, you will make some of your best friends in the industry and through work, but we don't owe each other that same level of relationship as family. But you do want to create a space. I have this horrible analogy that I said to someone once, and it's probably not the thing to quote, but uh, the Greek in me says that like culture in a place or in a space is a little bit like yogurt. You can't make more yogurt without a little bit of it already there. Like you can't manufacture culture. I think you can create the right environment for it to thrive and for it to grow. And it takes work. Like anyone who says that culture just exists has an incredible team that have already built that culture.
Yeah.
And, it's been incredible stepping into Red Antler, where I think, we, when I joined, we'd come through a really busy period, like lots of businesses, things had changed, the industry's changing. And the thing that I really loved was that they already had this great team that had this great energy. But props to lots of people in the business, but particularly like Kaiser, who's our CCO, who had just started at the time, or like had started maybe a year prior to me, had like actively made space for culture to thrive. So like once a month as a creative team, we head out on an outing that's run by the team. Like I have not had to like lift a finger. I just rock up and the creative team have come up with the most wild and like fun things from like we're in Bushwick last week, spray painting. Turns out I can't graffiti, but you know, we were like, we've done that. We've had private tours of Donald Judd's like studio, but we've also just gone to the beach together and had a picnic. And we basically like once a month give everyone that kind of Friday afternoon like to go and do that together. And not everyone can come every time. There's no pressure. People are really good at knowing like, hey, I'm really busy this week. I need to focus on this. But people show up because they want to, right? So like to the yogurt analogy, like there's the essence of it there, but you have to kind of feed it to keep making more. And it's just like it makes a great space because then when we are all like in the work together and working really hard, it just feels that little bit less stressful. Like it feels fulfilling because we're there together and we already kind of have this rapport. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that kind of gives a little picture of it. But it's a hard thing to do.
Wow, that was a fascinating answer from start to finish. That analogy is fantastic. Like you clearly, you're a very thoughtful leader.
Thank you.
Very cool. I love that answer. And you've worked across industries that couldn't be more different, you know, from finance and healthcare to food, technology, sports. I'm curious, after seeing so many categories, do you think every brand challenge eventually comes back to the same like fundamental human questions?
Interesting. I think that ultimately, like, even, you know, the what might be perceived as the most dry B2B business
Yeah.
ultimately has humans interacting in it. So, to your question, yes, like, ultimately it does come down to some level of humanity and how we interact with that. I mean, maybe this will change. AI is shifting the way that we work more and more. Um, but I think that there's a lot you can learn from other categories and apply to categories that it's not normally assumed. It's a little bit like to our earlier conversation of, you know, being able to just ask that question that everyone's thinking in the room.
Yeah.
It's not that simple to just get to that truth, but often like what lies at the center of, say, a really relationship driven B2B business, right, is
Yeah.
the same thing that might be from working with a really small theater company. It's like, okay, like how do we make those interactions feel special? What makes them feel special is going to be very different, right, in those different worlds. But I often love like when you can kind of pull inspiration or mix and match like where you've experienced things in completely different worlds, so to speak, and kind of bring them together. I think ultimately, like, not every brand has to have this like noble take on the world, right? Like there was definitely a moment where every brand needed to have this like big purpose, and even if you were selling trash bags to like the biggest stadiums in the world, you needed to have a purpose that was bigger than that. I think we've moved on from that. I think we understand that
Mhm.
sometimes a brand's role is really utilitarian, but I think what's true of every brand is their goal is to elicit a feeling in their customer or in their consumer and make that and repeat that feeling across the experience so that they can, that's in some ways how they feel differentiated, right? And we are moving into a world where, yes, sometimes there'll be a physical product and you can drive that feeling through that physical interaction or experience. But increasingly, like brands are existing in places with less and less tactile, like visible interface
Absolutely.
and spaces. And so, yeah, I know I've gone a bit off piece here, but I think like at the end of the day, you are trying to elicit a feeling, and feeling is innately human. But what that feeling is and what you're trying to drive is often very different in those categories. But the tactics you can use to elicit that, I think you can often borrow something from CPG to lend to tech. Tech can also make, you know, the way that tech behaves can often like change the way that we might want to drive consumer behavior at a shelf. Like there's so many ways that we can learn from these different categories, and or at least that's what I find exciting about not always
Yeah.
just working in one space.
I love how you connected those dots. I mean, And I couldn't agree more that at the end of the day, it's all about, what a brand, what something makes us feel, We're
Yeah,
human, like you mentioned. And when
it's
you
so true.
look, yeah, when you look across your career, from your early years as a designer in Sydney to leading global brand work in New York, there's a consistent thread of helping organizations find clarity and character. What do you hope people feel when they experience the brands and teams you've helped build?
Oh, that's so interesting. I think when I really look back at like what I want people to think or feel from the
Mhm.
work, I want it to be wildly different because ultimately, like every problem that's been brought to me across, like yes, there are some similarities at times, but normally the kind of brand that we're working with at that time has a certain challenge or a certain kind of milestone they're trying to meet, and they're often really different. I think that's where I've been really blessed. I've worked on everything from coffee table books to like theaters to global banks to like it's been very very varied. So I would hope that like at the essence of each of those projects you can start to feel not just like the choice of a typeface but what that brand was setting out to do at that moment in time. And these big brands, particularly like they're often scaling and changing and adapting. The smaller
Yeah.
brands are often like evolving very quickly. So it might be that when you come to interface with City or Crumble next, that their business has changed quite a bit since we worked together. But I would hope that you can still feel the essence of what we're like trying to establish at the core of those brands, whether that feeling that we were talking about before.
Truly, thank you for taking the time to join us and to share your very cool and wonderful and beautiful perspective. I think that one thing that stood out to me throughout this conversation is that, your career has never been just about creating great work. It's about creating the environments, the teams, the ideas that allow great work to happen, from evolving brands to mentoring creatives. You've built a career around helping organizations find their voice and bring their vision to life. And I think that's super cool. So I really, really, truly appreciate you sharing your experiences, your lessons, and the way you think about creativity and leadership. So thank you for being here. Oh, very cute dog that
And
just
yeah, this
appeared.
is my little coworker. He's a little bit lazy, but
We
he's
love lazy dogs.
he's not really doing much design work or mentoring himself, unfortunately. Um, but no, thank you so much for having me. And I think, like, ultimately at this point in my career, I get to have the best of both worlds where I get to like experience and live in this creative space, but also be like kind of endlessly like challenged and inspired by the people in my
Yeah.
teams. And I think that, um, you know, in some ways I have the stressful bit, but also the easy bit of getting to like help mold all these like wonderful things that like people are in our teams are like kind of making and thinking about, which gets me super excited.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful